When Laura Morgan appeared at the door of a remote residential area near the Texas border on a sweltering morning, she was almost unrecognizable. Gaunt, trembling, clothes caked in dust and dirt, and eyes hollow as if she had just stepped out of a place that didn't belong to this world. The woman had vanished 4 years earlier, along with her entire family during a trip into Big Bend National Park, a harsh wilderness where every theory had previously stopped at accident and traceless death. But what truly sent chills down the spines of medical personnel and police wasn't Laura's emaciated condition. The most terrifying thing was what she couldn't fully articulate about those 4 years, about what had happened to her husband and children, and about the dark place where people could be held, controlled, and erased from the world in silence. Some names and details have been changed to protect identities and privacy. Before diving deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. On the morning of March 14, 2021, the dusty gravel parking lot at the north entrance of Big Bend National Park carried an unusually quiet atmosphere as the Morgan family locked their car doors and stood silently for a few seconds before the vast wilderness that opened up in front of them. A barren, expansive land where the Chihuahuan Desert stretched endlessly, interrupted by low rock mountain ranges, deep canyons, and trails that could carry a person away from the outside world in just a few hours of travel. For the Morgan family, this trip wasn't just a short vacation, but carried a more personal meaning, seen as an opportunity to reconnect after many months of living in the separated rhythms of work and school, and it was the first time they ventured deep together into an area regarded as one of the most isolated and unforgiving national parks in the United States. According to relatives, they appeared well prepared, from drinking water, food, paper maps, to camping gear, but like many other visitors, that preparation took place in the belief that as long as they stuck to the planned route, all risks could be managed. The plan recorded at the ranger station showed that the family intended to leave the main road in the morning, travel along a less traveled trail branch, set up camp at a remote area marked on the map, and return to the meeting point by the end of the following day. During the first hours of the journey, everything went according to plan. The waypoints matched the estimated times, and weather conditions remained stable. The desert sunlight falling on the rock faces created a deceptive sense of peace, making the isolation of the surrounding space difficult to perceive. According to later confirmed communication data, around midday, the Morgan family made their last brief call to the outside world, reporting that they had turned off the main road and would not be able to maintain contact until returning to an area with signal, a piece of information completely consistent with the park's terrain, where cell phone reception often disappears after just a few miles. From that moment, silence began to envelop them, initially causing no concern, because it was considered normal for trips deep into the park, but as the afternoon wore on, and the Morgan family failed to appear at the agreed meeting point, the delay gradually became difficult to explain. The desert temperature dropped quickly as the sun set, strong winds began blowing through the mountain gaps, and darkness covered a land where the distance between rescue stations was measured in tens of miles, making any incident able to quickly spiral beyond self-help capability. By the next day, when the family still hadn't returned to the parking lot, hadn't appeared at any service area or ranger station, and no further communication signals had been recorded, the theory of a simple delay was no longer convincing. In the context of a park notorious for its absolute isolation and history of disappearances that left no trace, the prolonged silence of the Morgan family became a serious alarm signal, forcing the relatives waiting outside to make a difficult but unavoidable decision: officially report them missing to the park rangers, providing all information about the planned route, the time of last contact, and the unfulfilled meeting point, thereby marking the moment when what seemed like an ordinary family trip began to be viewed as a disturbing disappearance in the heart of a vast wilderness, where just a small deviation is enough for a person to be swallowed up without leaving any clear trace behind. Right after the relatives officially reported them missing, the authorities activated the emergency response protocol applied to incidents occurring in Big Bend National Park, where geographic distances, sparse visitor density, and limited rescue access, force every delayed report to be handled with the highest priority. The park rangers responsible for the northern area quickly reached the departure site, starting from the parking lot, where the Morgan family's vehicle was still parked in its original position, doors locked. With no signs of forced entry, collision, or movement, an important detail indicating that the vehicle was not the factor disrupting the journey. The rangers documented the surrounding conditions of the parking area, scanned the ground for unusual tire tracks, footprints, or abandoned items, while cross-referencing the last sighting time of the vehicle with the information provided by relatives to establish the precise timeline for when contact was lost. In parallel with accessing the scene, search commanders requested meteorological data for the relevant time frame, including daytime and nighttime temperatures, wind speed, humidity, and visibility. Because in a desert environment, sudden temperature swings between day and night can cause rapid dehydration, nighttime hypothermia, and diminished orientation ability. The weather report showed no major storms or rare extreme weather phenomena, but strong nighttime winds, sharply dropping temperatures, and intense daytime sun were factors sufficient to turn what seemed like a safe hike into a dangerous situation if the route was prolonged or water supplies were inadequate. Terrain assessment was conducted simultaneously using detailed topographic maps and the rangers' field experience, identifying the area the Morgan family had registered to pass through as a region with numerous shallow canyons, steep rocky slopes, unmarked natural forks, and trails that fade over time, conditions that facilitate getting lost without leaving clear traces. During the initial sweep, the authorities paid special attention to searching for signs typically associated with struggle or force, such as chaotic footprints, drag marks, abnormally scattered personal items, or reports from other visitors about cries for help or suspicious behavior. But none of these elements appeared at the departure area or the early segments of the trail. There were no reports of strangers approaching the Morgan family, no personal items discarded, and no indications that any confrontation had occurred at easily accessible locations. Based on the collected data, the rangers built working hypotheses, centered on the most common scenarios in the park, including the possibility of getting lost after leaving the main trail, exhaustion due to heat and dehydration, or falls on steep terrain sections, leading to inability to self-rescue. On that basis, the primary search perimeter was delineated, prioritizing a radius around the registered planned route, with focus on high-risk points such as canyon mouths, hidden rock crevices, trail segments crossing dry stream beds, and areas with shade or natural water sources that might attract hikers to stop. Ground search teams were deployed in small groups to ensure detailed observation of each sector, with each team assigned a specific segment to avoid overlap and omissions, while another group handled map analysis, cross-referencing average travel times and terrain conditions to predict the most likely directions if the Morgan family had deviated from the original plan. At the same time, authorities contacted nearby ranger stations and gathered information from other visitors who had registered routes during the same time frame to determine whether anyone had seen or interacted with the Morgan family before they disappeared. Logistical measures were prepared in parallel, including setting up staging points, planning for additional personnel and equipment if the search area needed expansion, reflecting a clear awareness of the challenges that a vast and isolated area like Big Bend poses to any search effort right from the very first hours. When the primary search efforts yielded no specific results, the authorities quickly expanded the search scale within Big Bend National Park by launching a multi-phase search and rescue campaign, mobilizing interagency forces, including park rangers, county rescue teams, trained volunteers, canine tracking units, and aerial support via helicopter during wind-permissible timeframes. The campaign was organized in systematic search grids, starting with the highest probability areas along the registered route, then expanding outward to more inaccessible terrain such as deep canyons, jagged rocky slopes, and open desert stretches where human traces are easily erased by wind and sand. During this process, the Morgan family's vehicle remained secured at the original parking lot, sealed and thoroughly inspected to rule out any unusual signs related to the vehicle. Results showed the vehicle in normal operating condition, no signs of hasty repairs, no abnormally discarded items inside, and no data indicating the vehicle had been moved since the family entered the park. In parallel with the sweeping of vast terrain, search teams began discovering scattered clues believed to be related to the Morgan family's journey, including some personal items, such as fragments of food packaging, faint shoe prints on rocky ground, and a small camping item found a significant distance from the main trail. These finds prompted flexible adjustments to the search perimeter to cover the areas surrounding where the clues appeared. Each discovery was documented, photographed, GPS marked, and context analyzed to determine whether they indicated disorientation or were simply items left behind during travel. However, the scattered and lack of clear connectivity among the personal items made accurately reconstructing the route extremely difficult. Search teams continued expanding the perimeter over consecutive days, facing the harsh desert conditions where high daytime temperatures, reduced effective working hours, and strong evening winds quickly erased newly formed traces, while rugged terrain forced many areas to be accessible only by foot at very slow speeds. Despite the use of tracking dogs to scent search, aerial support to observe large areas, and the involvement of numerous volunteers familiar with the terrain, no bodies were found, no clear signs of temporary shelter or a site of serious accident emerged, and no direct evidence helped determine the ultimate fate of the Morgan family. Over time, as subsequent search grids continued to produce no decisive results, the campaign's focus gradually shifted from emergency rescue to case documentation, compiling collected data, and assessing the feasibility of further expansion given limited resources and increasingly unfavorable natural conditions. Authorities had to confront the reality that in a vast and isolated area like Big Bend, the likelihood of finding clear traces decreases sharply with each passing day, especially without positioning signals, direct witnesses, or definitive scene indicators. After many weeks of continuous searching with the participation of dozens of different teams, the authorities reached an administrative but psychologically heavy decision for the relatives. The Morgan family's case was classified as presumed deceased, a term reflecting that no victims were located, despite the full deployment of all reasonable search measures under allowable conditions. This decision was not based on any specific discovery of bodies or final scene, but on the cumulative factors including prolonged missing duration, extreme environmental conditions, complete absence of communication, and search results yielding no evidence of prolonged survival. Along with this classification, the case file was moved to archived status, officially becoming a cold case within the park's management system and related agencies, meaning large-scale search operations were terminated and would only be reactivated if new information or evidence surfaced. For the public and those directly involved in the campaign, this conclusion left a profound void, because despite mobilizing maximum available resources, the question of what really happened to the Morgan family remained without a clear answer, and Big Bend continued to hold within itself a traceless disappearance, recorded on paper as an administrative conclusion, but still existing as an enigma, never fully explained. 4 years after the Morgan family's case file was archived in prolonged silence, an entirely unexpected event occurred in a sparsely populated residential area near the southern Texas border, hundreds of miles from Big Bend National Park, when a gaunt woman in tattered clothing and staggering steps appeared early one morning at the door of a private home, in a state of near total exhaustion. The woman was later identified as Laura Morgan, the mother from the family previously classified as presumed deceased 4 years earlier, but at the time of her discovery, she carried no identification documents, no phone, no wallet, and was unable to provide personal information in a coherent manner. The first residents to make contact with Laura described her in a state of severe physical collapse, emaciated to the point of skin and bones, clothing inappropriate for the current weather, skin darkened by sun exposure, and covered in overlapping old and new scratches, indicating she had lived outdoors or in unhygienic conditions for an extended period. When asked her name or where she came from, Laura displayed clear disorientation, with fragmented answers, vacant eyes, and frequent loss of focus. She could not identify the date, did not know where she was, and was unable to estimate how much time had passed since she last remembered being with her family. Medical personnel and local authorities, called to the scene, quickly recognized that the woman was not only physically compromised, but also exhibited severe disorientation symptoms, including confusion between day and night, lack of awareness of basic time markers, and slow responses to simple questions. During the initial examination, no signs of acute drug or alcohol intoxication were found, but severe malnutrition, prolonged dehydration, and untreated injuries indicated a long-term survival process under deprivation and abandonment conditions. The fact that Laura carried no identification made initial identity verification difficult, especially since she could not consistently confirm personal details herself, forcing authorities to rely on biometric data and physical identifying features to cross-reference with the missing persons file. Old scars, bone structure, and certain medical characteristics previously recorded in the Morgan family file gradually matched the woman receiving care, strengthening the likelihood that this was indeed Laura Morgan, who had vanished with her family 4 years earlier during the park trip. While the verification process was still ongoing, Laura's health continued to deteriorate, with unstable vital signs, low blood pressure, irregular heartbeat, and signs of total systemic exhaustion, prompting medical staff to make an emergency decision to transfer her to the nearest medical facility for intensive treatment. At the hospital, Laura was admitted in critical condition, requiring intravenous rehydration, nutritional support, and close monitoring of basic bodily functions, while the medical team simultaneously noted abnormal psychological manifestations, such as excessive defensive reflexes, startle responses to unexpected contact, and a tendency to withdraw when in enclosed spaces. Doctors assessed that Laura's condition was inconsistent with someone who had just experienced a single event or short-term accident, but rather reflected the cumulative consequences of a prolonged period living under harsh conditions, without medical care, and possibly enduring extended psychological stress. The sudden reappearance of Laura Morgan was quickly reported to state-level agencies, as it directly related to a previously classified and archived missing persons case, while raising a series of serious questions about what had happened over the past 4 years, even though at that point, Laura was still not lucid enough to provide any valuable explanation. For those who directly witnessed her condition, this reappearance did not resemble a normal return, but rather the emergence of a survivor, just pulled out of a years-long social void, where a wasted body and disordered mind simultaneously reflected an extreme experience far removed from the initial assumptions of a disappearance due to environmental accident. The severe discrepancy between the old file and the current reality forced the authorities to change their approach, as right after the woman was admitted to the medical facility in critical condition, state-level units immediately coordinated with the hospital to implement a cautious and systematic identity confirmation process, because the sudden reappearance after 4 years of an individual previously classified as presumed deceased was not only a rare medical event, but also carried especially stringent legal and procedural requirements. The process began with the collection of basic biometrics right at the bedside, including fingerprints, high-resolution facial images, jawbone structure, and other identifying features that do not change over time, in the context where the woman was still not lucid enough to confirm personal information herself. Fingerprint data was sent to the federal system for cross-referencing with archived records, while also being directly compared with biometric data previously collected from Laura Morgan in administrative documents and medical records before her disappearance, a crucial step to rule out the possibility of confusion or impersonation in cases of such highly sensitive nature. In parallel with the biometrics, investigators accessed Laura Morgan's historical medical records, including data from routine checkups, minor surgeries, dental records, and specific medical features, such as tooth structure, old surgical scars, and medical history, elements that often hold high identification value, even when the current physical condition has changed significantly. Forensic doctors and medical identification specialists conducted detailed comparisons of each feature, noting significant matches between the woman under treatment and Laura Morgan's file, from the shape of the jaw joint, the positions of small scars, to rare dental structure details previously recorded. To strengthen the conclusion, the investigating agency requested DNA testing, taking samples from the woman in the hospital and comparing them with stored DNA samples from the Morgan family members that had been collected during the search 4 years earlier, a step considered the gold standard in identity verification cases involving complex legal factors. While awaiting results, the case file was temporarily removed from archive status, allowing relevant units to access and update newly emerging information, while ensuring that all subsequent decisions were based on scientific confirmation rather than speculation. The subsequent DNA test results showed a near-absolute probability match between the found woman and Laura Morgan, confirming that this was indeed the mother who had vanished with her family during the trip into Big Bend National Park 4 years earlier, and the only family member confirmed alive up to this point. With this result, the authorities officially concluded the woman's identity as Laura Morgan, while also noting that her current physical and mental condition was inconsistent with any previously considered scenarios of voluntary departure or short-term disappearance. The identity confirmation triggered a series of legal and procedural consequences, forcing the authorities to make the official decision to fully reopen the Morgan family's missing persons case, changing the case status from cold case to active, allowing re-examination of all previous hypotheses, evidence, and administrative conclusions in light of the new information. This decision was issued not only because of Laura Morgan's survival, but also because the reality of an individual disappearing for 4 years and then reappearing in a state of severe exhaustion and cognitive disorder raised the possibility of undiscovered factors that were not detected during the initial search. Along with reopening the file, the relevant agencies began reviewing all previously collected data, from the registered route, the personal item traces discovered during the search campaign, to weather reports and rangers' activity logs during the early days of the family's disappearance, in preparation for a new investigative direction consistent with the fact that at least one member had survived for a long period after vanishing. Meanwhile, Laura Morgan continued to be kept under special medical care, not only to stabilize her health, but also to ensure that every interaction with her took place in full compliance with legal and medical standards, avoiding further harm to a person just confirmed as a victim of a prolonged incident of unknown nature. The identity confirmation did not close the story. On the contrary, it became the starting point for a new series of questions, forcing the investigative system to re-examine the entire case with a completely different assumption from 4 years earlier, when the Morgan family was first considered to have vanished permanently in the wilderness. After Laura Morgan's identity was scientifically confirmed, and the case file was reopened, the focus immediately shifted to in-depth medical evaluation to determine the nature of her health condition and reconstruct what her body had endured during the 4 years of disappearance, a process carried out by a multidisciplinary team of doctors, including internal medicine, nutrition, orthopedics, neurology, and psychiatry. The initial test results quickly showed that Laura was in a state of chronic prolonged malnutrition, with her body mass index at a dangerous level, nearly depleted fat reserves, severe deficiencies in protein, iron, B vitamins, and numerous essential micronutrients, signs that could not develop in just a few weeks or months, but reflected a years-long process of inadequate and unstable caloric intake that failed to meet the minimum physiological needs of an adult human body. Blood biochemistry analysis revealed that Laura's internal organs had been forced to adapt to prolonged energy deficiency, manifested through metabolic disorders, mild liver function decline, recurrent electrolyte imbalances, and signs of generalized muscle atrophy, particularly evident in large muscle groups, such as the thighs, hips, and shoulders. Orthopedic doctors noted severe musculoskeletal joint damage due to prolonged movement restriction, including joint stiffness, reduced range of motion, premature degeneration of weight-bearing joints, and muscle weakness disproportionate to the patient's biological age, indicating that Laura had gone through an extended period of limited mobility, unable to walk or move freely, as someone living independently in a natural environment would. Examination of the musculoskeletal system also detected signs of accumulated microtrauma, including small healed misaligned fractures, old ligament injuries, and chronic lower back pain, all without corresponding medical treatment records, reinforcing the assessment that these injuries had occurred and healed incompletely under conditions lacking professional care. In parallel, doctors noted numerous old wounds on Laura's body, including laceration scars, healed superficial burns, recurrent skin infections, and some deeper injuries that had been treated in a crude, non-standard medical manner, leaving poor scars and mild complications, showing that she had not had access to formal healthcare systems for a long time. Notably, these wounds were distributed in locations difficult to self-treat, such as the lower back of the thighs, and shoulder areas, raising questions about Laura's ability to self-care in such circumstances. When cross-referencing all clinical data, medical experts proceeded to rule out the possibility that Laura could have survived independently in the natural environment for 4 full years, especially under the harsh geographic and climatic conditions of the desert and mountainous regions of southern Texas, because her level of malnutrition, musculoskeletal damage, and overall health condition were inconsistent with someone maintaining long-term outdoor life through survival skills. Survival models referenced by the experts show that an individual living independently in the wild typically exhibits contrasting adaptive signs, such as increased muscle endurance in certain groups, acute environmental injuries, and a different energy distribution pattern, whereas Laura's condition reflected lack of movement, controlled nutritional deprivation, and dependence on minimal but regular supply. From these analyses, the medical team raised a strong suspicion that Laura had been held in a controlled environment where movement was restricted, food rations were limited, and medical care was virtually non-existent, rather than freely living in the wild. This suspicion was not based on a single sign, but on the combined result of multiple consistent medical factors, including the degree of emaciation, the pattern of musculoskeletal injuries, the nature of the scars, and the absence of long-term survival adaptation indicators. Doctors also noted that Laura's psychological state, with high defensive reflexes, excessive startle responses, and a tendency to withdraw when approached, was compatible with what is commonly seen in victims of prolonged detention or control. Although this assessment still needed to be conducted cautiously and separately from any legal conclusion, the entire in-depth medical report was compiled into a detailed file and handed over to the investigating authorities, not to reach a final conclusion about the nature of the incident, but to clearly establish a medical reality. Laura Morgan's condition was the consequence of a prolonged systematic process that went far beyond what could be explained by an environmental accident or independent survival, and severe enough to compel the authorities to re-examine the entire case approach from a completely different perspective than the initial assumptions made 4 years earlier. In parallel with the medical evaluation, the investigating agency requested a comprehensive forensic psychological assessment of Laura Morgan to determine her cognitive state, level of mental trauma, and ability to cooperate within the legal framework, a process conducted by forensic psychiatrists experienced with victims of prolonged detention and control. Right from the initial sessions, doctors noted clear and pronounced signs of severe post-traumatic stress disorder (PTSD), including extreme startle reactions to unexpected noises, constant hypervigilance, difficulty maintaining eye contact, rapid increases in heart rate and breathing when asked personally relevant questions, along with unpredictable panic attacks triggered whenever she felt controlled or observed. These symptoms were not fleeting but stable, recurrent, and directly impacted Laura's ability to concentrate and regulate emotions throughout the entire evaluation process. In addition to PTSD, experts identified that Laura was experiencing prolonged dissociative disorder, manifested through emotional detachment when referring to certain past periods, changes in voice tone and speech rhythm when shifting between topics, as well as clear memory gaps that she could not fill herself even when prompted with neutral questions. At many points, Laura described events using the third person or impersonal phrases, indicating a psychological mechanism to create distance between her present self and the severely traumatic experiences. One of the most prominent features noted was the loss of sense of the passage of time, as Laura was unable to accurately identify dates, months or years, frequently confusing events separated by weeks with those that may have occurred years apart, and sometimes unable to distinguish real memories from fragmented images that surfaced in a hazy state. Experts assessed that this disruption in time perception was not merely a consequence of physical exhaustion, but a common sign in victims of long-term confinement in monotonous environments, where time markers become blurred due to the lack of social stimulation and normal daily rhythms. Deeper evaluation revealed that Laura exhibited post-detention psychological dependency, a state in which the victim, even after escaping the controlled environment, retains behavioral reflexes formed during the period of captivity, such as waiting for instructions before performing simple actions, asking permission before eating or using the bathroom, and showing clear anxiety when required to make independent decisions. These behaviors were not consciously recognized by Laura, but appeared as automatic reflexes, demonstrating the deep penetration of psychological control mechanisms during her time separated from society. Experts also noted that Laura tended to protect or downplay negative experiences when asked directly, a mechanism commonly found in victims of prolonged detention, stemming from a mixture of fear, psychological conditioning, and survival needs within a controlled environment. From a forensic perspective, these features led to an important operational conclusion: Laura's current capacity to provide full, coherent, and consistent testimony was severely limited. The experts emphasized that forcing detailed statements in her present psychological state would not only diminish the legal value of the obtained information, but also risked re-traumatization, exacerbating PTSD, and dissociative symptoms. Therefore, all interactions between Laura and the investigating authorities were recommended to strictly adhere to victim protection principles, including short interview durations, non-leading questions, the presence of a psychological specialist, and the right to stop immediately upon any signs of mental overload. The forensic psychological report concluded that Laura's mental state was consistent with someone who had endured prolonged detention and control, where personal safety depended on compliance and adaptation to externally imposed rules, and that the recovery of cognitive function and the ability to recount events would require a long period of time along with intensive therapeutic intervention. The entire assessment was compiled into an official file, not to interpret or speculate about perpetrators, but to clearly establish Laura's current limitations as a surviving witness, while laying the necessary psychological foundation for every investigative step in the context of a case that had far exceeded the framework of an ordinary disappearance. After the forensic psychologist determined that Laura Morgan could only participate in the statement-taking process at a minimal level and under strict control, the investigating agency proceeded to collect preliminary statements under tightly supervised medical and psychological conditions, with the goal not being to reconstruct the entire sequence of events, but to record the spontaneous fragments of information that Laura could provide without causing re-traumatization. Right from the start, Laura's statements exhibited a pronounced discontinuous quality, with answers often emerging in disjointed segments, out of chronological order, and impossible to connect into a coherent narrative thread, as she might begin with a sensory detail such as light, smell, or sound, then abruptly shift to an entirely unrelated image, without any clear logical connection. In many instances, Laura would stop mid-sentence, lose the ability to continue expressing herself, or appear confused when asked to clarify the relationship between the details just mentioned, an expression consistent with the prior assessments of dissociative disorder and loss of temporal awareness. Nevertheless, within this fragmented chain of memories, investigators noted the repeated appearance of a third-party figure, described by Laura in vague and inconsistent terms regarding appearance, gender, or specific role, yet appearing with sufficient frequency to be considered a noteworthy element. Sometimes this figure was mentioned as a silent presence, sometimes as someone giving instructions, and in a few other moments appeared in frightening contexts, causing Laura to display clear tension responses whenever the memory was touched upon. Notably, Laura did not associate this figure with a name, a specific face, or a clear designation, but described it only through sensory qualities, such as a low voice, a silhouette standing at a doorway, or the feeling of being watched, indicating that the memory of this figure existed more at an emotional level than as a structured perception. When asked about the place of detention, Laura was unable to clearly identify any specific geographic location, did not recall place names, could not describe routes of movement, and could not distinguish whether she had been in one fixed structure or multiple different places, only mentioning enclosed spaces, dim lighting, unusually stable temperatures, and the monotonous repetition of the surrounding environment. These descriptions, though insufficient to pinpoint a crime scene, were carefully recorded because they showed a clear contrast to an outdoor natural environment, reinforcing the earlier medical suspicions that Laura had not survived independently in the wilderness. The issue of time continued to be a major barrier in the statements, as Laura could not identify key milestones, such as the moment the family was separated, the duration she was held, or the beginning and end of different phases in her memory, frequently confusing what she considered recent with events that may have occurred many years earlier. In some interviews, the same detail was recounted by Laura, with varying length and context, not in direct contradiction, but in shifts of nuance and emphasis, reflecting a defensive restructuring of memory, rather than an intent to conceal information. Investigators were instructed not to ask Laura to confirm or deny unclear details, but only to record verbatim what she voluntarily shared, clearly separating statement data from investigative inferences. The entire content of the preliminary statements was audio recorded, transcribed, and coded by sensory themes, behaviors, and appearing figures, rather than chronological order, in order to preserve the original nature of the information, given Laura's limited cognitive capacity. Investigators emphasized that details about the third-party figure, the detention environment, and the separation from family, though not yet verifiable, still held directional value for subsequent analytical steps if placed in connection with medical data and physical evidence collected in the past. However, at this stage, all information from Laura's statements was classified as noted but unverified, not to be used for drawing conclusions or compelling investigative actions, in order to avoid the risk of building hypotheses based on the unstable memories of a victim recently emerged from prolonged detention. This approach reflected the authorities' special caution toward a statement that was vitally human in nature yet fragile in structure, where every detail could be an important clue or merely a fragment of a deeply traumatized memory, and distinguishing between those two possibilities required time, cross-referencing, and independent verification, far beyond what could be accomplished immediately in the process of re-engaging with the victim. After the preliminary statements from Laura Morgan were recorded and categorized by sensory information clusters rather than chronological sequence, the investigating agency shifted to verification using objective data to assess the degree of correspondence between what Laura described and the actual geographic and environmental reality of Big Bend National Park, because only through independent cross-referencing could they determine which memories reflected real events and which were consequences of post-traumatic cognitive disruption. Map analysts began by overlaying Laura's fragmented descriptions of enclosed spaces, dim lighting, stable temperatures, and the absence of environmental variation onto the detailed topographic maps of Big Bend, an area renowned for its large day-to-night temperature swings, intense natural daylight, and near-total exposure to natural elements. This comparison quickly revealed a stark incompatibility between Laura's recollections and the characteristics of an outdoor environment, as even the deepest canyons or most sheltered rock crevices in the park could not sustain the lighting, temperature, and environmental stability conditions that Laura described over an extended period. Next, terrain specialists conducted a detailed analysis of natural water sources in the area, including seasonal springs, dry riverbeds, and temporary water catchments, cross-referenced against the chronic malnutrition and dehydration documented in Laura's medical file, thereby evaluating the feasibility of her accessing regular water supplies if moving freely within the park. The results showed that sustaining life for multiple years in Big Bend would require precise location of rare water sources continuous seasonal movement, and adaptation to harsh conditions, a survival pattern entirely inconsistent with the musculoskeletal injuries, reduced mobility, and lack of physiological adaptation signs recorded in Laura. Further terrain discrepancy analysis clarified this issue when investigators compared Laura's vague descriptions of movement with the actual trails in the park, demonstrating that the distances necessary to travel from the initial disappearance point to southern border areas would demand sustained continuous locomotion in open terrain, something Laura's physical condition over the years could not support. In parallel, survival models were applied to compare the feasibility of independent survival for an individual against Big Bend's natural conditions, including energy requirements, minimum water needs, shelter capability, and injury care. And when Laura's medical condition was placed into these models, experts unanimously concluded that the possibility of her freely moving and surviving in the park for 4 years was physiologically and environmentally unrealistic. The absence of typical signs found in long-term outdoor survivors, such as call-used hands, prolonged sun-induced skin damage, or specific musculoskeletal adaptations, further reinforced the exclusion of the hypothesis that Laura had moved freely in the wilderness after the family's disappearance. Additionally, Laura's inability to describe characteristic Big Bend elements, such as vegetation, wildlife, the smell of desert rock and soil, or changes in light over time in her memories, while focusing solely on enclosed spaces and feelings of being controlled, created a significant divergence between the real experience of an outdoor survivor and what she recalled. Investigators also cross-referenced the missing period with historical climate data, identifying multiple episodes of extreme weather during those 4 years, including prolonged heat waves and unusually deep cold, conditions that someone in Laura's physical state would have found extremely difficult to endure without stable shelter and minimum supplies. From the synthesis of these analyses, the hypothesis of Laura freely moving or randomly hiding in Big Bend was systematically ruled out, not based on subjective speculation, but on the incompatibility between medical data, survival models, and geographic reality. Instead, the analysts reached an operational conclusion that there must have existed at least one fixed or semi-fixed detention location where Laura was held under controlled environmental conditions, restricted movement, and access to resources at a minimal but stable level, sufficient to sustain life over a long period without producing outdoor survival adaptation signs. This conclusion did not identify a specific location or perpetrator, but it marked a crucial shift in the understanding of the case, as objective data for the first time confirmed that what happened to Laura Morgan could not be explained by environmental accident or ordinary disorientation scenarios, but must be considered as the result of deliberate spatial control occurring over a sufficiently long time frame to leave clear imprints on both the victim's body and memory. Based on the operational conclusion that Laura Morgan had been held in a fixed or semi-fixed space for an extended period, the investigating agency launched environmental and spatial tracing as an independent axis of analysis, starting with micro-environmental forensics on soil, dust, and organisms adhering to her body, clothing, and accompanying items upon reappearance. Microsoil samples collected from under fingernails, fabric folds, hair strands, and open scars were subjected to mineralogical analysis, revealing a significantly higher proportion of fine clay and slowly decomposing organic particles compared to the characteristic desert soil of Big Bend National Park, while lacking the angular quartz grains and coarse sand typically found in open windswept environments. This result suggested a soil base that had been modified or long-term covered, consistent with the foundation of an auxiliary structure, storage facility, or private land with a stable surface. Pollen and microplant particle analysis on the clothing further showed the presence of common weeds and shrub species around sparsely populated residential areas, along with traces of old cultivated vegetation, in contrast to the dominant native flora within the park, thereby ruling out regular direct exposure to open wild vegetation over a prolonged period. The forensic entomology segment provided additional exclusion data by detecting eggs and fragments of insect species that prefer enclosed, stable temperature, low-wind environments, typically associated with warehouses, outbuildings or semi-enclosed spaces, while absent were species characteristic of the highly seasonal outdoor desert environment. In parallel with biological tracing, spatial analysts conducted time series satellite data cross-referencing over the 4-year span, using high-resolution periodic imagery to detect subtle fluctuations imperceptible to ordinary observation, such as the appearance and disappearance of temporary coverings, changes in small vehicle tracks, recurring soil compaction patterns, or surface tone alterations, suggesting covering and uncovering activities. Time-lapse image overlay methods were applied to exclude natural variations due to rain, wind, or erosion, focusing instead on repetitive and directional indicators commonly associated with human activity. When combined with topographic maps and unofficial road networks, the analysts identified several discrete access corridors, allowing motorized entry and exit without passing through high-traffic tourist routes, consistent with the secrecy requirements of a detention site. The next step involved reviewing land ownership records and current usage status of private parcels adjacent to the park, prioritizing those with ambiguous usage histories, infrequent regular occupancy, prior modifications for agricultural, livestock, or storage purposes, and evidence of auxiliary structures not fully updated in building records. This cross-referencing aimed to identify areas with stable soil bases, minimal electricity or water access, controlled entry-exit capability, and sufficient isolation to avoid public attention. Environmental criteria were applied simultaneously, including relative temperature stability, sound isolation potential, limited direct natural light, and signs of minimal exposure to strong winds, to ensure consistency with Laura's fragmented sensory descriptions of her prolonged living space. The narrowing of suspect areas was conducted by progressively eliminating locations that failed to meet multiple biological, mineralogical, botanical, entomological, and spatial criteria simultaneously, rather than relying on a single piece of evidence, in order to minimize the risk of over-inference. The converging results highlighted several clusters of private land parcels on the southern and eastern edges of the park, with higher degrees of match, where soil showed signs of prior modification, vegetation aligned with pollen data, and satellite imagery recorded periodic micro-fluctuations consistent with discrete human activity. These clusters were marked at the level of plausible points, rather than definitive, as the objective of environmental tracing was to narrow the search space based on objective data without exceeding the scope of evidence. The entire results were synthesized into a multi-layer suspect map, in which each data layer served as mutual cross-verification, creating a consistent spatial framework for identifying high-probability detention sites, while ensuring that all assessments stemmed from the correspondence between environmental traces and the victim's biological and psychological condition, rather than speculation or pressure to produce a quick resolution. From the multi-layer suspect map constructed based on environmental tracing, a private parcel of land located on the southern edge of Big Bend National Park was identified as the point with the highest degree of match and was selected for on-site approach in strict accordance with legal procedure, because this area featured a structure not fully documented in official building management maps, concealed behind low shrub lines and rolling terrain, difficult to observe from public roads and completely outside the line of sight of tourist trails. When authorities approached, the structure appeared as an old auxiliary building, outwardly resembling an abandoned storage shed or agricultural outbuilding, constructed with simple materials, no signage, no public utility connections, and no recent permitting records. The initial approach was conducted cautiously, to document the site in its pristine state, during which investigators quickly detected numerous signs of long-term habitation, inconsistent with an abandoned structure, including floor wear patterns repeating along a narrow trajectory, soil compaction marks at fixed positions, indicating restricted movement within a small space, and temporary repair traces carried out over time, rather than in a single phase, Inside the structure, natural light was maximally restricted by crude but effective coverings. Small windows or ventilation slits were sealed with semi-transparent material, allowing only minimal light penetration, enough to sustain basic activity, but without creating a clear day-night cycle, a feature consistent with prior analyses of the victim's loss of temporal awareness. The entry-exit system was designed for movement control, with external locks and secondary bolts, allowing operation from the outside, while any secondary exits or windows were either too small or reinforced to prevent unauthorized departure from the space. In this area, investigators noted signs of controlled resupply, including simple repetitive food packaging by type without seasonal variety, along with minimally replaced daily items, indicating a regular but limited supply chain sufficient to sustain life without allowing stockpiling or flexible use. Crude heating and ventilation devices were arranged to maintain stable temperatures, reflecting not adaptation to external environmental conditions, but deliberate efforts to control the microclimate of the space, consistent with medical data showing Laura Morgan had not experienced the characteristic thermal fluctuations of outdoor survival. Overall assessment of the structure's layout revealed an organization oriented toward movement restriction, with a small usable area, overlapping functional zones, and a lack of elements permitting self-directed living, such as no independent cooking tools, no communication devices, and no full ability to observe the external environment. These characteristics were regarded by experts as consistent with a long-term detention site, where the objective was not concealment through overt violence, but control through space, light, daily rhythms, and complete dependence on external resupply. Cross-referencing the scene with prior environmental analyses showed clear compatibility, from soil composition, traces of enclosed environment preferring insects, to the absence of elements typical of free outdoor living, reinforcing the assessment that this was not a temporary stop but a space used continuously over an extended period. After completing the preliminary documentation, authorities proceeded with scene preservation measures, minimizing unnecessary entry, establishing security perimeters, and controlling access to prevent disturbance of valuable physical forensic traces. The structure and surrounding land were sealed in accordance with regulations, allowing specialized units to continue detailed evidence collection under controlled conditions, while ensuring all evaluations were based on an undisturbed state. The discovery of a facility fully meeting the criteria for spatial control, lighting, resupply, and movement restriction did not equate to a complete resolution of the entire case, but for the first time anchored the investigation to a specific physical entity, where medical, psychological, and environmental conclusions could be directly verified, transforming inferences from hypothesis into a tangible, measurable crime scene capable of forensic measurement, analysis, and validation. On that foundation, immediately after the structure was sealed and its condition preserved, specialized units launched a rigorous scene examination, focusing on reconstructing the true functional use of the space throughout its period of occupancy, with emphasis on identifying and collecting traces reflecting deliberate and prolonged detention behavior. Forensic experts began by inspecting the entire structure for restraint indicators, including fixed anchor points on walls, floors, and door frames, where numerous locations showed unusual wear marks, metal scratches, and residues of rope, cable, or soft materials that had been repeatedly tied and released over time, indicating that movement restriction was not a one-time event, but recurrent. On the floor, and certain low surfaces, parallel scratches and discolored patches were documented, consistent with dragging heavy objects or human bodies within a confined area, while no signs indicated the space had ever been used for labor or free living. The mandatory activity zone was identified through analysis of wear distribution, item placement, and the absence of alternative areas, showing that the detained person could essentially only eat, sleep, and function within a very small restricted zone, where light, temperature, and ventilation were all controlled, while remaining areas of the structure were either inaccessible from inside or fully locked. In this zone, investigators recovered minimal daily items such as simple dishes, thin blankets, temporary waste containers, and crude hygiene materials, all reflecting an imposed living pattern that permitted no personal choice or adjustment. Notably, the examination also revealed clear signs of multiple people being held at different times, or simultaneously, as the small space contained distinct separate wear points, bedding impressions of varying sizes, and personal items inconsistent in size and degree of use, indicating the space was not designed for a single individual. Experts analyzed that the overlapping but non-synchronous traces reflected sequential or simultaneous detention of multiple victims over different periods, rather than a short-term event. Criminal evidence collection proceeded in parallel, including fiber samples, hair, shed skin fragments, biological traces on high-contact surfaces, and materials potentially bearing DNA, all packaged, sealed, and precisely location noted for laboratory analysis. Food packaging, supply items, and daily utensils were collected to determine origin, production dates, and replacement cycles, thereby clarifying the frequency and method of resupply, an important factor in proving the existence of an organized detention process. Additionally, investigators noted the deliberate absence of items that could facilitate self-liberation or communication, such as sharp tools, electronic devices, or signaling means, showing the space had been deliberately arranged to eliminate all possibilities of self-determination for the detained. Scene documentation was conducted in detail, including spatial diagrams, high-resolution photographs, descriptions of each trace, and relationships between functional zones, creating a comprehensive record, allowing reconstruction of the scene without physical presence in subsequent analyses. All collected data was categorized by functional group, from restraint traces, daily living, movement, to resupply and control, to support an overall assessment of the criminal nature of the space. The examination process was not only to determine what had occurred here, but also to prove that this structure fully met the criteria of a long-term detention facility, where human control was achieved through spatial structure, materials, and systematic repetition, creating an environment where life was sustained at a minimal level, while all autonomy was stripped away. The complete scene file became a crucial physical foundation, allowing investigators to connect what had been recorded on Laura Morgan's body and mind to a specific tangible space, where traces were no longer abstract, but existed as measurable, comparable, and verifiable forensic evidence, thereby transforming a years-long chain of suspicions into a clearly structured crime scene. From the scene data indicating that this was an organized detention facility, the investigating agency shifted focus to identifying the subject capable of controlling and maintaining this space over a long period, beginning with legal tracing of the land ownership, where the structure was discovered, thereby determining the registered owner as Daniel Hargrove, 55 years old, an individual with a valid land record, but a history of residence and occupation that lay almost entirely outside conventional social monitoring systems. Land registry documents showed that Hargrove had purchased this parcel many years earlier under the designation of personal use, with no registration for commercial purposes, no building permits for auxiliary structures, and no tax activity reflecting any stable income source, creating a significant gap between legal ownership and actual usage. In parallel with tracing the land records, investigators reviewed personnel who had worked around the Big Bend area during the period when the Morgan family went missing, including seasonal laborers, private maintenance workers, hires for small ranches, mobile repairmen, and individuals who had appeared in scattered park rangers' reports regarding trespassing or living near the park boundary. During this process, the name Daniel Hargrove appeared multiple times in disparate data sources, not as an official employee, but as an individual familiar with the area, previously noted for appearing around secondary roads, old supply stations, and rarely visited parcels. Indirect witness interviews revealed that Hargrove led a highly reclusive lifestyle, with minimal social interaction, frequent changes of temporary residences within the same region, and a tendency to avoid contact with authorities, a pattern of living that made him nearly invisible in standard monitoring systems, yet familiar enough to avoid drawing particular attention. Upon deeper analysis, investigators discovered that Hargrove lived largely off the grid, maintaining no fixed residential address, no official employment record for many years, minimal use of healthcare services, and almost no presence in major financial transactions, conditions that facilitated unmonitored movement and sustained activities. The Criminal Record Review continued to provide crucial pieces when it showed that Hargrove had previously been involved in low-level violence cases and controlling behavior in past personal relationships, including allegations of threats, unlawful restraint, and psychological manipulation, though many of these did not result in convictions due to insufficient evidence or victim withdrawal. Old reports described a consistent behavioral pattern in which Hargrove displayed a high need for control, a tendency to isolate others from social environments, and the use of dependency as a tool to maintain power, characteristics disturbingly consistent with the detention structure discovered at the scene. Investigators also found that during the period of the Morgan family's disappearance, Hargrove had large gaps in his documented activity history, with no clear evidence of residence or employment, yet there were signs of regular access to routes leading to the suspect parcel through indirect data such as cash fuel receipts, witness accounts, and vehicle movement traces on unofficial trails. When cross-referenced with the inferred resupply timeline from the scene, including cycles of item replacement and food packaging, the matching rhythm of activity began to form a troubling picture of Hargrove's potential long-term control over the detention space without apparent external support. Behavioral analysts were brought in to evaluate Hargrove's profile, concluding that his off-grid lifestyle, combined with an unaddressed history of violence and a high need for control, created a psychological profile consistent with prolonged detention behavior, especially in the context of a vast, sparsely populated area with significant monitoring gaps like the edges of Big Bend. The designation of the primary suspect was not based on a single piece of evidence, but on the convergence of multiple independent data layers, from land ownership, scene traces, behavioral history, lifestyle patterns, and psychological fit. At this point, Daniel Hargrove was identified as the central suspect in the case, not because of any public presence or overt violent behavior at the time of the scene discovery, but because of the deeply disturbing alignment between the man himself, the discovered space, and what had happened to Laura Morgan throughout her 4 years of disappearance, laying the foundation for subsequent investigative steps to clarify his specific role in the control, detention, and severe harm inflicted on the victim. From the accumulated investigative data, the analysis of criminal motive was deployed as a process of decoding logical control rather than seeking impulsive violent behavior, because the entire chain of events showed a highly deliberate victim selection built on an understanding of the environment, people, and the capacity for long-term concealment. The suspect did not approach a single individual randomly, but targeted a family unit venturing deep into a remote area, where disappearance could easily be attributed to environmental accident, getting lost, or natural death, thereby creating the necessary time buffer to establish control without detection. Within that structure, the mother was retained not due to emotional or sentimental factors, but because she embodied the characteristics that behavioral experts describe as ideal for long-term control, including high endurance, a tendency to sacrifice for others, a strong sense of responsibility, and a willingness to comply if it was believed that doing so could protect remaining loved ones. The core motive was identified as an absolute need for control, in which seizing autonomy, restricting information, and restructuring the victim's perceptual world became the central objective, far exceeding any specific material benefit. The exploitation of the victim occurred in the form of forced minimal labor, serving daily needs, or more simply maintaining presence as an owned object, where the value lay in imposed power rather than tangible output. Investigators observed that this pattern relied on sustaining a prolonged state of asymmetry, in which the suspect retained access to food, light, movement, and information, while the victim was placed in a position of having to adapt for survival, gradually forming psychological dependency as a defense mechanism. Maintaining power through detention did not require constant violence, but depended on latent threat and selective punishment, sufficient to reassert dominance whenever the victim showed signs of resistance or disruption of the established order. In that context, violence became a strategic tool, rather than an emotional reflex, used to reinforce fear and re-establish compliance, while minimizing traces that could attract outside attention. This motive also explained why resistant individuals, or those who could not be controlled, were removed from the detention space, because their presence threatened the stability of the entire power structure, forcing the suspect to make decisions aimed at protecting the system he had built, even if that meant separation or elimination. Retaining victims who were easy to control, prone to internalizing imposed rules, and accepting dependency allowed the suspect to prolong the state of control for years, without significant changes to the operating method. The signs of multiple detentions discovered at the scene indicated that this was not a one-off act, but a repeating pattern, where each victim was evaluated, screened, and handled based on their level of threat to the central power. In the case of the mother, the prolonged conditioning process led to diminished autonomy, loss of time perception, and deep psychological dependency, reflecting the success of the control strategy rather than the randomness of circumstance. Experts emphasized that the control motive explains the consistency across seemingly disjointed details, from the choice of an inaccessible detention site, regular but limited resupply methods, to the control of light and movement space, all serving the goal of maximum power with minimum risk of detection. More importantly, this motive clarifies why the case left no clear signs of struggle or overt coercion at the time of disappearance, because the initial objective was not immediate harm, but the establishment of a discrete, silent, long-term control system. In the overall analysis, the criminal behavior was viewed as a deliberate structure, where every decision served to maintain dominance and concealment, creating a form of crime based on power rather than overt violence. Clarifying the criminal motive thus not only helps explain the mother's fate, but also allows investigators to identify a dangerous behavioral pattern with potential for recurrence, because it is precisely the combination of calculated victim selection, psychological exploitation, and prolonged detention that forms the core element, turning this case into a systematic crime, enduring persistently in the shadows for many years. From the reconstruction of the sequence of events based on scene evidence, medical analysis, and the recorded fragmented memory fragments, the detention process of the Morgan family was determined to begin with a deliberate act of separation immediately after they were subdued, in which each member was stripped of the ability to contact one another, to break the family structure, and eliminate the capacity for coordinated resistance. The father, with his protective reflexes and tendency toward direct confrontation, became the first target of violence when he attempted to resist, in order to create an opportunity for his wife and children to escape, leading to a short but intense struggle that ended with his being killed. His body subsequently concealed in a systematic manner to eliminate evidence and prevent any possibility of tracing. The elimination of the father was not merely immediate but also served a strategic role in reinforcing power, as his presence was assessed as the highest destabilizing factor to the control structure the suspect was establishing. Following that event, the children were placed under harsh detention conditions, deprived of food, light, and medical care, with severely restricted movement, and an environment unsuitable for long-term survival, leading to rapid physical deterioration. Forensic analyses indicated that the children's deaths did not result from direct violent acts, but from a prolonged chain of detention conditions, where malnutrition, dehydration, and untreated infections combined with extreme stress made their young bodies unable to sustain life. Allowing the children to die under those conditions reflected a coldly calculated decision, as the suspect determined they could not be controlled long-term, while the presence of multiple victims increased the risk of detection. In contrast to the fate of the father and the children, Laura Morgan was retained long-term as a central part of the detention structure, not out of compassion, but because she met the identified control criteria, including high endurance, a tendency to comply when faced with threat, and susceptibility to conditioning through isolation and psychological manipulation. Laura's detention took place in a space designed to sustain life at a minimal level, but sufficient to prolong dependency, where food was supplied in a controlled manner, light was adjusted to blur time perception, and all movement occurred within strict limits to prevent any notion of freedom. Experts assessed that Laura's survival over many years was the result of a stable operating system, in which the suspect simultaneously acted as both captor and the sole source of every basic need, creating a coerced dependency relationship from which the victim could not escape without facing immediate survival risk. The concealment of the crime was achieved through a combination of choosing a remote location, strict information control, and exploiting natural hypotheses such as environmental accident to mislead, allowing the suspect to maintain a hidden state for many years without drawing significant external attention. Scene evidence showed systematic removal of traces related to the deceased victims, including relocation, burial, or destruction of any evidence that could lead to early discovery, while Laura's retention was disguised as a complete disappearance from the social world. This process not only reflected a high degree of calculation, but also demonstrated patience and the capacity to sustain criminal behavior over an extended period, something rarely seen in impulsive violent acts. The prolonged existence of the detention state allowed the suspect to consolidate power and gradually reduce the risk of detection, as each passing year weakened public attention and investigative resources, turning what was once a shocking case into a faded memory. For Laura, surviving under those conditions meant trading away much of her personal identity, as adaptation for survival forced her to accept imposed rules and gradually relinquish notions of resistance, a process that left profound psychological consequences, clearly documented in professional evaluations. Overall, the detention process and the fate of the Morgan family were not a series of disconnected accidents, but the product of a deliberately sustained criminal structure, in which the separation, elimination, and retention of each member all served the goal of absolute control and concealment of the behavior over many years, creating a family tragedy that existed in silence until the very structure began to show cracks that could no longer be concealed. It was precisely in that context that Laura Morgan's escape was reconstructed by investigators as the consequence of a rare lapse in a control system that had operated stably for a long time. When familiar rules were disrupted by an unforeseen change in the perpetrator's routine and supervision, opening a brief but sufficient window for the victim to seize the opportunity and act. According to behavioral assessments, this lapse did not stem from intentional loosening, but from accumulated complacency, as the suspect believed the psychological dependency state had reached an irreversible level, leading to a reduction in direct control intensity and greater reliance on conditioned compliance habits. In that moment, Laura utilized the observational skills honed over years of captivity, recognizing the temporary absence of supervision and the existence of a previously unpermitted movement path, deciding to leave the detention site without taking any items beyond the clothes on her body, because any attempt to search for more would prolong the time and risk losing the fragile opportunity. The departure from the detention space did not occur as a decisive flight, but as a slow, cautious disengagement, where each step was weighed to avoid creating sound or signs that could lead to detection and being pulled back, reflecting the depth of fear embedded in the victim's reflexes. Once outside the direct control perimeter, Laura faced a new challenge no less dangerous, moving through a vast and harsh environment without clear orientation, no map, no time reference, and no full understanding of the distance to the nearest populated area. Medical experts assessed that in her prolonged debilitated state, Laura's spatial perception and decision-making capacity were severely impaired, making her journey largely random, relying more on survival instinct than planning, with constantly changing directions based on terrain and temporary water sources. Over many days, she moved without direction, frequently stopping due to exhaustion, forced to choose between continuing forward or taking temporary shelter, a recurring decision in a hazy state where day and night blended due to perceptual disorder. Prolonged nutritional deficiency meant every movement effort consumed energy beyond the body's recovery capacity, leading to acute collapse episodes in which she had to lie immobile for hours or days before being able to continue, increasing the risk of dehydration, hypothermia, and infection. Signs on Laura's body showed numerous scratches, bruises and secondary injuries, consistent with moving through rocky terrain, thick brush, and areas without clear trails, where every step carried the risk of further trauma. Investigators assessed that her refusal to return to the detention site, despite possibly perceiving the risk of death in the natural environment, reflected a critical psychological threshold that had been crossed, when the risk of staying was perceived as greater than facing the outside world. Upon approaching areas with signs of human presence, Laura was already in severe collapse, with dehydration, hypoglycemia, and altered consciousness, limiting her ability to seek help and forcing her to follow artificial structures, such as secondary paths, fences, or distant lights, without determining the necessary distance or time. The final hours before discovery showed her body at the brink of failure, with standing becoming difficult and basic reflexes weakening, increasing the risk of falling and unconsciousness before reaching help. In that state, Laura appeared on her own at a medical facility in a residential area near the border, not as someone actively seeking it out, but as an individual guided by survival instinct to a place with light and human presence, where she collapsed immediately after crossing the threshold of safety. Medical staff recorded that she was unable to independently provide full information about her identity or circumstances, with slow responses to stimuli, and signs of altered consciousness, consistent with a collapse phase following a prolonged journey under extreme conditions. For the investigators, this escape was not the result of a complete plan but the rare convergence of a control lapse and an instinctual survival decision, where the victim seized a single moment to leave a detention system that had shaped her entire life for many years. Laura's self-appearance at the medical authorities closed the physical state of detention, but at the same time pushed the case into an entirely new threshold, where her survival was no longer the central question, but became living proof of a prolonged captivity process, forcing all prior assumptions to be re-evaluated in light of the medical and psychological data. From the moment Laura Morgan's identity was confirmed, and the expert evaluations firmly reinforced the hypothesis of systematic detention, the focus of the entire case immediately shifted to prosecutorial action, as the authorities mobilized resources to plan the arrest and prosecution of the primary suspect Daniel Hargrove, in the context of a subject with a history of living off the grid, knowledge of the terrain, and the potential risk of destroying evidence if there was any delay. The arrest was carried out after prosecutors approved the warrant, based on an initial body of evidence strong enough to establish probable cause, including the direct link between Hargrove and the parcel where the detention facility was discovered, the long-term habitation traces matching the period of Laura's disappearance, along with environmental and biological data connecting the victim to that space. Law enforcement approached Hargrove at a location outside the park area, choosing a time when the subject was least likely to have access to vehicles or conditions to flee, and the takedown proceeded swiftly, with no significant resistance, consistent with his behavioral profile, showing avoidance of direct confrontation when the advantage of power was no longer in his hands. Immediately after the arrest, investigative teams simultaneously executed expanded supplemental searches of the scene, covering a broader scope than previous approaches, including auxiliary structures, secondary access points, storage pits, burial areas, and concealed or modified enclosed spaces, to ensure no evidence was overlooked that could clarify the full chain of criminal conduct. This search process was conducted under strict forensic protocol, with each area documented, measured, and sealed, allowing experts to reconstruct the operational methods of the detention facility, from light control and movement restriction to resupply and daily activity management. During the process, investigators seized additional key evidence, including restraint tools, construction materials, reflecting intentional modifications for spatial isolation, daily items showing long-term use traces, and biological samples of comparative value, all contributing to strengthening the connection between the suspect and the prolonged detention behavior. In parallel with the searches, forensic laboratories proceeded to solidify physical evidence by analyzing soil, dust, and biological samples, comparing them with data collected from Laura's body, and the surrounding areas of the detention site, thereby establishing an irrefutable scientific chain linking the victim, the scene, and the suspect. These results were placed within a specific timeline, allowing proof that Laura's presence at the detention facility was continuous over many years, ruling out random contact or short-term stay. Meanwhile, investigators conducted stepped interrogations of Hargrove, not aimed at obtaining an immediate confession, but focused on recording reactions, inconsistencies, and gaps in statements, as supplementary data to cross-reference with already established physical evidence. The suspect's choice to remain silent, or offer inconsistent statements, was fully documented, not weakening the case, but rather further emphasizing its reliance on objective evidence, rather than confession. Once all data was compiled, prosecutors worked closely with investigators to finalize the criminal charges, constructing an indictment that fully reflected the grave and systematic nature of the conduct, including offenses related to kidnapping, prolonged unlawful detention, infliction of serious physical and mental harm on the victim, along with acts of concealing the crime to evade detection by authorities. The completion of charges was carried out on the principle of caution, ensuring each count was supported by multiple independent layers of evidence, from forensic, medical, environmental, to behavioral analysis, to minimize the possibility of dismissal in court. After the charges were determined and approved, the entire case file was transferred to the prosecutorial office to initiate the formal prosecution process, marking a clear transition from investigation to legal proceedings, where the focus was no longer on tracing, but on proving criminal responsibility before the justice system. The transfer of the file carried profound symbolic meaning for the authorities, as it represented the conclusion of a prolonged and complex investigative process, in which each scattered piece of evidence was strung together into a complete picture of criminal conduct concealed for many years. For the legal system, this moment marked the official departure of the case from the investigative domain into the orbit of trial, where truth is no longer pursued through operational inference, but must be proven by rigorous evidentiary standards and strict procedural rules. At the same time, for the investigators, it was the moment of handing over responsibility, from reconstructing the truth to the task of protecting and presenting that truth in court, establishing the final boundary between investigation and adjudication. In that context, the trial of Daniel Hargrove proceeded under heightened security measures and special public attention, with the prosecutorial focus placed on presenting a continuous and consistent chain of evidence, strong enough to reconstruct the entire multi-year criminal conduct, from the connection between the suspect and the parcel adjacent to the park where the detention facility was discovered, to the forensic, medical, and environmental evidence, directly linking Laura Morgan to that place of captivity. Prosecutors presented each layer of evidence in chronological and behavioral logic order, from Hargrove's ownership and actual control over the land, the intentional modifications designed to isolate and control the space, to the long-term signs of habitation consistent with prolonged detention, thereby creating a comprehensive picture for the jury of how the detention system was established and operated. During this process, scientific data played a central role, as soil, dust, and biological sample analyses were cross-referenced with the injuries and condition of Laura's body, proving her continuous presence at the scene over many years and ruling out random contact or voluntary residence. Laura's testimony, though fragmented and limited by psychological trauma, was presented as part of the overall evidence, not standing alone, but rigorously cross-checked against the scene and objective data, demonstrating significant compatibility between her disjointed memory fragments and the physical structure of the detention site. Medical and forensic psychology experts were called to explain to the jury why the limitations in the testimony did not undermine its probative value, but instead accurately reflected the characteristics of a long-term detention victim, while reinforcing the argument that the physical and mental injuries could only arise under conditions of systematic control and isolation. The prosecution continued to align the testimony with scene traces, from the locations of mandatory activity areas, restraint tools, to the methods of light control and resupply, proving that the victim's descriptions matched the physical reality in a way that could not plausibly be coincidental. Defense arguments attempted to question the directness of certain evidence and the completeness of the testimony, but were countered by emphasis on the convergence of multiple independent data sources, where each individual piece might not be decisive, yet together formed an unbroken, irrefutable logical chain. In the closing arguments, the prosecutors focused on establishing criminal responsibility beyond a reasonable doubt, pointing out that Hargrove not only facilitated, but directly maintained and operated the detention system, actively concealed the conduct, and deprived the victim of freedom over an extended period, while bearing criminal responsibility for the consequences arising from those detention conditions. The jury was instructed to view the case not as a series of disconnected events, but as a structured criminal act, where the intent to control and the suspect's agency were evident throughout, from the choice of location, the method of detention, to the ways of concealing and prolonging the behavior over many years. After deliberation, the verdict was announced in a tense atmosphere, as the jury determined that the presented chain of evidence was sufficiently strong to conclude that Daniel Hargrove bore full criminal responsibility for the charged acts, including kidnapping, prolonged unlawful detention, and offenses related to the infliction of serious physical and mental harm on the victim. The judge, in sentencing, emphasized the exceptionally grave and systematic nature of the case, stating that this was not impulsive behavior, but a prolonged abuse of power that caused irreparable consequences to multiple individuals and deeply violated fundamental societal values. Based on those factors, the court imposed a sentence of life imprisonment without parole, affirming that the defendant would be permanently isolated from society to protect the community and reflect the severity of the law in the face of prolonged control and detention conduct. The verdict was delivered not only as punishment for the individual offender, but also as a clear statement about responsibility and the limits of power, affirming that every effort to conceal and sustain criminal behavior will ultimately fail to escape the light of forensic science, persistent investigation, and rigorous judicial process. However, the consequences of the case did not end with the court's verdict, but continued to extend into Laura Morgan's life as an irreversible reality, as post-trial medical evaluations confirmed that her health condition carried long-term, difficult to fully recover damage, including chronic malnutrition, leaving lasting effects on her cardiovascular and digestive systems, musculoskeletal injuries, from years of restricted movement, limiting her ability to walk and self-care, along with old untreated wounds that left scars and chronic pain complications. In addition, neurologists noted signs of cognitive decline related to prolonged stress and lack of stimulation during detention, causing Laura's ability to concentrate, remember, and process information to be permanently diminished, forcing her to live with ongoing medical and social support. Psychologically, although no longer detained, Laura still faced the aftermath of severe post-traumatic stress disorder, manifested through panic attacks, recurring nightmares, excessive startle responses, and a persistent sense of unsafety, even in protected environments, showing that legal freedom does not equate to liberation from the invisible consequences of captivity. Therapists emphasized that Laura's psychological recovery has no clear endpoint, but is a long journey with many phases of regression and progress interspersed, in which the realistic goal is not to return to her pre-disappearance state, but to build a new level of stability for the rest of her life. In parallel with Laura's personal condition is the heartbreaking reality that the Morgan family can never be restored, because the loss of lives and time permanently shattered the original family structure, where her husband and children were lost in irreversible circumstances, leaving a void that nothing can fill. For Laura, survival does not mean reunion, but comes with survivor's guilt, as she must continue living while her dearest loved ones are gone, a psychological burden that experts describe as especially difficult to manage because it is tied to her maternal instincts and role as family protector. On a social level, the case created a profound impact far beyond the individual scope, forcing the public and authorities to re-examine long-held assumptions about disappearances in wilderness environments, where natural accidents are often considered a sufficiently convincing explanation to close files. thereby raising questions about the system's readiness to consider the possible existence of organized criminal elements in contexts that appear purely environmental. The case also sparked discussions about the boundaries between public and private land, about how an off-grid individual can sustain criminal behavior over a long period without detection, and about the responsibility of managing agencies in monitoring hard-to-access border areas. Within the local community, the case left a lasting psychological aftershock, as trust in the sense of safety tied to familiar spaces was eroded, and the realization that a crime could occur silently for many years without anyone knowing forced residents to confront a new form of unease. On a broader scale, the case became a reference point in investigative and forensic training programs, used as an example of the importance of combining scientific data, behavioral analysis, and persistent investigation to break initial assumptions that could lead to premature case closure. However, even when criminal justice was served with a life sentence without parole, the limits of justice remained starkly clear in the reality that no verdict can restore what was lost, cannot return life to the deceased victims, or erase the years stolen from Laura's existence. Legal observers emphasize that the sentence, though severe, addresses only the criminal responsibility aspect, while the emotional, familial, and personal identity losses lie beyond the capacity of any legal system to compensate. For Laura, the conviction of the perpetrator provides a degree of legal closure, but it does not equate to peace, because the memories, reflexes, and pain remain as part of her daily life. In the overall picture, the aftermath of the case reveals a profound gap between justice and healing, where the law can punish and prevent recidivism but cannot reverse time or fully restore the wounded. It is precisely within that gap that Laura Morgan's story endures as a reminder of the true cost of crimes concealed in silence, and of the inevitable limits of justice when confronted with tragedies that have become deeply embedded in body, mind, and social fabric, leaving lingering echoes that extend far beyond the closing of a courtroom. The story of Laura Morgan is not just a personal tragedy, but also reflects many very real issues in contemporary American life, where freedom, vast open spaces, and faith in personal safety sometimes obscure silent risks. The Morgan family entered Big Bend with the familiar mindset of many American families, believing that wilderness is a place of challenge but fairness, where risks primarily come from the environment rather than from other people. It was precisely that assumption that caused the initial disappearance to be viewed as a natural accident, only for a systematic crime to remain hidden for many years. The first lesson from this story is the necessity of balanced vigilance, loving nature, respecting personal freedom, but never underestimating the possibility of criminal behavior even in places that seem the most pure. Laura's case also demonstrates the dangerous limits of an individual living off the social monitoring grid, like Daniel Hargrove, who can exploit the gaps between public and private land, between administrative oversight and real-life reality, to maintain power and control over others. In the context of modern America, where privacy and personal freedom are highly valued, this story reminds us that communities and authorities need to maintain early detection mechanisms and not rely entirely on the accident assumption when dealing with prolonged disappearances. Finally, Laura's survival journey underscores a profound lesson about the long-term consequences of concealed violence. Justice can convict the perpetrator, but it cannot return the family, the time, or the health that was lost. That places a responsibility on American society today, not only to punish crime, but also to provide long-term support for victims, to respect the limits of recovery, and to understand that true freedom is not merely being released from captivity, but living in a community that listens, protects, and does not turn away from unusual signs. If you find Laura Morgan's story brings deep reflection on freedom, justice, and the cost of silence, please subscribe to the channel to continue joining us in more authentic and haunting true cases. Thank you for listening until the very end, and see you in the next video, where we will keep looking straight into the dark corners to better understand the value of safety and humanity in today's life.